The cabin was a quiet hum of ordinary air travel, the kind of noise that most passengers barely noticed. It was a sound of routine, something that filled the space, but didn't demand attention. The flight was about an hour in the air, and Jessica was already moving through the aisles, her tray cart rolling silently under her hand as she passed row after row of people. She had done this 1,000 times. It was all the same questions, the same small talk, the same polite smiles. But then there was the man in seat 14B. His eyes didn't flicker at her approach, not even a glance. When she stopped by his row, she felt something cold settle in her chest, like a shift in the air, something off. But she couldn't quite place it. He was older, tall, with a thin grey mustache and glasses that looked like they'd been purchased decades ago. His suit was rumpled, as if he'd worn it all day without care. His eyes locked onto hers for a moment, and that was enough to make her hesitate. She cleared her throat, forcing a smile she had practiced 1,000 times, and asked him the usual question. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" He didn't answer at first, just stared. His gaze was sharp, cold, as though he were studying her with a strange intensity, almost as if he were trying to figure her out. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise, but she kept her composure, still smiling, her eyes warm, but not too much, her voice pleasant, but firm. "Just offering you something to drink. Would you like some water or juice, sir?" His lips barely moved. When he spoke, his words slow, deliberate, but when they came they were thick with something she couldn't place, a kind of bitterness, or maybe anger. There was something there simmering just beneath the surface. "It's always the same with you people, isn't it?" he muttered, his voice gravelly and low like the rumble of thunder off in the distance. "You all smile and pretend to care, but you never do you?" Jessica's smile faltered only slightly, but she quickly recovered. Something about his tone didn't sit right in her gut. It wasn't just irritation, it was something darker, something deeper and more dangerous. But she had learned over the years to ignore those instincts, to push them down, to smile through the discomfort. She could feel the eyes of the passengers in the rows beside her shifting. They were watching now, quietly murmuring behind their hands, as the man continued. "I've seen it all. Before you think you're better than everyone else, just because you wear that uniform." He was talking to her now, his voice louder, as if the accusation wasn't just for her, but for the entire crew. "You think people don't notice how you look at them, like they're less than you." She could feel the tension in the air building, but she stayed calm, her voice soft and steady. "Sir, I'm just here to assist you if you need anything," she said, hoping to steer the conversation back to something more neutral. But the man didn't seem to hear her. His eyes flickered with something wild behind them, his fingers tightening into fists. He leaned forward, his breath sharp with frustration. "I don't need your help. Don't pretend to care," he spat, his voice rising with each word. The rest of the passengers were shifting now more openly, eyes wide. Some looked to the flight attendants, who were just out of sight in the galley. Others were already reaching for their phones, maybe to record the scene. But no one seemed to know how to intervene. The tension was palpable, thick and suffocating, and Jessica felt it too. She could sense that the situation was spiraling out of control, but she didn't know how to stop it. She tried again. "Sir, if you need help, I'll get the captain to assist you." He didn't respond, not immediately, but his lips curled up into a sneer. "Don't talk to me like I'm an idiot," he hissed. "I know exactly what you're doing. The whole damn plane is a stage for your little performance, and I'm not buying it." Jessica's stomach churned. The tension wasn't just between them now, it had spread across the entire cabin, and she knew this was no longer just a bad interaction. This was something more, something dangerous. And as she looked around at the faces of the passengers, she realized that they all felt it too. The eyes that were once filled with indifference now watched with open fear and curiosity, as the argument between them grew louder with every passing second. The man's voice grew louder, his words faster, like a river, swelling with each passing second. "I'm not going to sit here and be treated like this," he shouted, the sound of his voice echoing off the walls of the cabin. His face was red now, his fists were clenched, and his breathing came in ragged gasps, as if every word he spoke took more effort than the last. He was shaking slightly, but not with fear. It was anger raw and uncontrolled. Jessica's heart raced, her mind spinning. She had never encountered a passenger like this. Before, there had been others who were rude or demanding. But this felt different, like he was ready to explode at any moment. Her eyes flicked to the other attendants in the galley. One of them was already on the phone with the captain. She could see the tension in their faces too. They knew this was serious. The situation was slipping from her control, and she needed help. But for now, all she could do was try to calm the man. Before things got worse, I'm asking you again, please sit down and calm down. She said, her voice steady, but her hands were trembling slightly inside the sleeves of her uniform. Her stomach was tight with dread, her mind racing through every protocol she had ever learned, how to handle a disruptive passenger, how to de-escalate the situation. But nothing seemed to work. This man wasn't listening to reason. The passengers were growing more nervous now. She could hear the low murmurs spreading through the rows, the soft rustle of people shifting in their seats, as if they too could feel the shift in the air, the sense of danger building and building. He wasn't going to stop. He was shouting now, accusing her of being part of some grand conspiracy of airline workers who didn't care about their passengers, who treated them like cattle. The words made no sense, but the venom behind them was clear. Jessica's mind flickered to the possibility of him being intoxicated or maybe mentally unstable. But there was no way to know for sure. All she could do was try to get through this moment without making it worse. But it was becoming harder to ignore the feeling that this wasn't just about bad service anymore. There was something else in the way he spoke, something calculating, something that made her skin crawl. Don't you understand the way you're all talking to me? He continued, his eyes darting around the cabin, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. You think I'm just going to sit here quietly while you all pretend to be better than me, do you? He glanced around, as if waiting for someone to agree with him, his eyes scanning the rows of seats, almost like a predator looking for his next target. But the passengers only stared back at him wide-eyed, some too scared to speak, others frozen in their seats, unable to process what was happening. Jessica's mind raced. She could feel the eyes on her now, the weight of their gazes heavy with judgment. Some had their phones out already recording, but she didn't care about that right now. She just needed to calm the man before something worse happened. She took a step closer and lowered her voice. Sir, please. I don't know what's going on, but I'm here to help. I'm just trying to make sure you have what you need. Nothing more, nothing less, she said. But as the words left her lips, she knew they were falling on deaf ears. He was beyond reason, now his face contorted with fury, as he lunged forward out of his seat, his hands slamming onto the armrest. Between them, the passengers around them gasped. Some recoiled, others whispered quickly to each other. But the man didn't care. His voice rang out again, louder this time. You're all in on it, aren't you? You think you can control me, don't you? As the words left his mouth, Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. The anger in his voice wasn't just personal. It was something deeper, darker, like he believed in a conspiracy that only he could see, and now he was dragging everyone else into it. She stepped back instinctively, but the man didn't stop. He was on the edge, now trembling with anger and frustration as his fists tightened and his body tensed like a coiled spring. Jessica's eyes darted to the front of the plane. She could see the captain's door beginning to open. She wasn't sure if they were coming to help or if they were preparing for something more. She hoped it was the former, but deep down she felt that this was far from over. The man was still standing now, pacing back and forth, his steps heavy and deliberate. The tension in the cabin was suffocating as the air seemed to grow thicker with every passing moment. Jessica could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow, as she watched him move back and forth, like a trapped animal, his eyes darting from side to side, searching for something or someone to lash out at. The other passengers were completely still, frozen in their seats, not daring to make a sound. It was as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would break. His voice had lowered now, but it was still sharp, like a blade cutting through the quiet of the plane. "You think this is normal, don't you?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, but the venom behind it was clear. It was as if he were trying to convince himself of something, anything, to justify the madness in his head. Jessica felt a chill run through her spine as she looked around the cabin once again. The passengers were all staring, but no one moved, no one spoke, not even the woman from earlier who had tried to intervene. Her seat was empty now. Jessica hadn't seen her leave. But it struck her as odd. She looked back at the man. His hand was shaking now, and his voice began to crack. "It's all a lie, everything's a lie," he said, his eyes wild as he began pacing again. But this time his steps were quicker, frantic, like he couldn't stay still for even a second more. "Don't you see what's happening?" he continued, his voice louder now, so much louder than before. "They're watching us, they're watching everything we do." As he spoke those words, the cabin door at the front of the plane opened slightly, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside. They walked slowly at first, their eyes scanning the cabin, before they locked onto the man in 14B. He froze, his body tensing, as though he could feel them before they even reached him. His eyes widened, and for the briefest moment, Jessica could see a flicker of recognition in his face. But it wasn't fear, it was something else, something darker and deeper, something that sent a wave of dread through her chest. He stopped pacing and looked at the officers with a strange calmness, as if he had been expecting them. His lips parted for a moment, like he was about to say something, but the words never came. Instead, the officers approached him with slow, deliberate steps, their faces impassive as they stood before him. Without saying a word, one officer nodded and motioned for the man to follow him. But the man didn't move, not immediately. Instead, he looked at the officer for a long moment, his eyes narrowed as though weighing his options, before he finally let out a low laugh, a sound so hollow and empty that Jessica could feel the weight of it settle in her stomach. "No one ever listens to me," he muttered, shaking his head slowly as he slowly stood up from his seat and started walking toward the officers. But his movements were stiff, like he was dragging himself unwillingly forward. Every step seemed to take more effort than the last, as if he knew what was coming but couldn't stop it now. The officer on the left stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm, but the man yanked it away violently, as though he couldn't stand to be touched. The other officer moved in to help, but the man was already shouting again, his voice cracking as he screamed, "Stop, stop, trying to control me. I know what you're doing. Stop it. They're all in on it. The whole damn world's in on it." But no one cared anymore. The noise from the man's outbursts seemed to fade into the background as Jessica watched helplessly. The officers didn't hesitate. They grabbed the man's arms, one on each side, and began to escort him toward the exit of the plane. The passengers sat in stunned silence. No one moved, no one said a word as the man was dragged off the plane, his protests growing softer with each step, until they were lost in the hum of the aircraft's engines. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She stared at the empty seat, where the man had been, wondering what had just happened, what had triggered his breakdown, what had set him off in such a terrifying way. And as the officers disappeared down the aisle, the cabin was left in a suffocating silence that no one dared to break yet. Despite the quiet, there was an unspoken tension that lingered in the air, like the calm before a storm. Everyone knew that something had shifted, something had broken, and no one knew what would happen next. The plane was eerily quiet now, the hum of the engines filling the space as the passengers sat frozen in their seats. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen, or maybe hoping that nothing more would unfold. But the silence felt heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. The officers had disappeared down the jetway, and still no one moved, no one spoke. Their eyes remained glued to their phones, their laps, or the windows. But Jessica could feel their gaze lingering on her, her heart still racing as she moved down the aisle, trying to pretend like everything was normal when she knew it wasn't. She glanced at the seat where the man had been, but now it was just an empty space, a vacant spot where moments ago something had felt dangerously wrong. She tried to shake off the unease, But it clung to her skin like a layer of sweat. The situation was far from over. She could feel it in her bones. The tension in the air hadn't dissipated it, had just been temporarily suspended. The unease, still simmering just beneath the surface, her mind kept returning to that man, the way he had acted, the way he had spoken, like he was part of some twisted game, something she couldn't fully understand. But now that he was gone, the passengers began to shift in their seats, murmuring quietly to each other, their voices low and uncertain. Some people were still on their phones, likely checking social media to see if anyone had posted about what had happened. Others were just staring blankly ahead, trying to forget. But the reality of what had just occurred wouldn't let them escape. It was too fresh, too raw to ignore. Jessica glanced back at the other flight attendants. They were gathered in the galley now, whispering to each other, their faces pale, their eyes wide. They looked just as shaken as she felt. But no one dared to speak openly. The weight of the situation hung over them like a shadow, and they all knew that the rest of the flight would be anything but ordinary. The air felt thick with an unspoken question. What had happened to that man? And why had he acted the way he did? She couldn't shake the thought. What had triggered him? What had made him snap like that? And why had he singled her out? She had never felt so exposed, like a target being aimed at. She had dealt with rude passengers before, but this had been different. This had been something far darker, something far more dangerous. She knew that the captain was aware of what had happened, but she couldn't help but wonder if anyone was really prepared for whatever had come on that plane. The flight attendants exchanged another look, and one of them stepped forward, her voice low and hesitant. "So do we go back to serving, or what?" she asked. The words hung in the air for a moment. Before anyone could answer, Jessica felt a surge of something inside her. Maybe it was just exhaustion, or maybe it was the lingering adrenaline still buzzing through her veins. But the question didn't sit right with her. "No, we need to stay alert," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but determined. It wasn't just about serving drinks anymore. The passengers were unsettled. The tension was palpable. And who knew what kind of baggage this man had left behind in the cabin? His words were still echoing in her mind. "The whole damn world's in on it. No one ever listens to me." She felt her pulse quicken again. What had he meant by that? Was he just an angry passenger? Or was there something else, something deeper at play? She didn't know. But she felt a growing sense of unease, gnawing at her. Something was wrong with the world outside the plane, the world they had left behind when they took off. But it was getting harder to ignore the growing feeling that something had changed, that something was out there waiting, watching them all, as if they were trapped in the sky like insects in a jar, unable to escape. But what was it? What was happening? What was coming? And would they be ready when it arrived? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, this time more urgent than before. "Attention, all passengers. We are making another unscheduled stop, this time in Salt Lake City. We ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we approach the airport." The change in plans was enough to draw a collective gasp from the passengers. Some of them began to shift in their seats. Others fumbled with their seatbelts, as if the new announcement had finally broken the silence. But for Jessica, the feeling of dread only deepened. The last thing they needed was another stop. But now it seemed like they had no choice. Something was unfolding, something that they couldn't stop, and all she could do was wait and hope that they weren't too late. The plane began its descent, and the sound of the engines changed in pitch as they adjusted for the landing. The cabin felt even quieter. Now the hum of the flight barely audible as the lights above flickered ever so slightly. But it wasn't the lights or the noise that was unsettling. It was the weight of the moment, the feeling that something terrible was lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding. The captain's announcement had left everyone on edge. And as the plane made its way towards Salt Lake City, Jessica's mind raced. She kept replaying the scene with the man in seat 14B, his outbursts, his accusations, his wild eyes, and the way he had looked at her, as though she were the cause of all his frustration. But why her? Why had he targeted her? What had triggered that strange, violent outburst? There was no answer, no simple explanation, only the sense that something was terribly wrong with everything and everyone around her. She stole a glance at the other flight attendants. They were all busy checking the passengers, securing the cabin, preparing for landing. But their faces told a different story. The tension was still there in their eyes, the same uncertainty that Jessica felt deep down. But they kept moving through their duties. Without a word, none of them had spoken much since the incident, not even to each other. It was as if no one knew what to say, how to deal with what had just happened. The thought of the passengers behind her in the cabin made her feel uneasy. She could hear them whispering quietly, some of them, still staring at their phones, likely checking social media or discussing the events that had just unfolded. But there was something else, something in the air that made her feel like they were all in danger, as if they were caught in the middle of something they couldn't see or understand. Jessica swallowed hard and forced herself to focus on the task at hand. She needed to stay calm. She needed to keep herself together. The plane was nearing its destination, but something told her that when they landed things wouldn't be over. Not by a long shot. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden jolt of the landing gear touching the tarmac. The passengers all shifted in their seats. Some exhaled with relief, others continued to stare out the windows, like they were looking for answers somewhere in the distance. Jessica felt the familiar tug of the seatbelt sign flashing and heard the click of belts being fastened around her. She looked out of the small portal window. As the plane taxied down the runway, the city lights below sparkling in the dark desert night. But the familiar sight didn't bring comfort. Instead, it heightened her sense of dread. It felt as though they were being led somewhere they shouldn't go, as if the ground beneath them wasn't a safe haven, but a trap waiting to close around them with every turn. She couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over, that something was waiting for them in Salt Lake City, something that had nothing to do with the usual airport protocol. The plane finally came to a stop, and the engines began to hum in a lower pitch. The flight attendants began to move again, going through the final checks. As the cabin doors were prepared for opening, Jessica stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She glanced back at the seat where the man had been just hours ago. His absence seemed to linger in the air like an unresolved mystery. The doors finally opened with a soft hiss, and the first few passengers began to disembark. But Jessica didn't move. She stayed in place, her eyes darting toward the front of the plane, where she could see airport security officers approaching along with a few plainclothes detectives. Their faces were grim and focused as they scanned the cabin, looking for something or someone. And it was then that she realized that they weren't just there for the man from seat 14. Below this was much bigger than that. They were here for something else, something that none of them had expected. And the feeling of danger that had been growing inside her suddenly felt far too real. As the detectives and officers began to step into the plane, Jessica caught a glimpse of something in their hands, something that made her blood run cold. A small box wrapped in black plastic. They didn't look at her as they passed by, but Jessica knew that whatever was in that box, whatever they were carrying, it wasn't going to stay contained for long. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a brief moment she wondered if they were all being led into a trap. What had just happened to them? Who was behind it all? And how much danger were they really in? The detectives moved swiftly through the aisle, their eyes scanning the cabin with a cold precision. As the passengers began to file off the plane slowly and reluctantly, Jessica watched them closely, her heart still racing, her mind buzzing with questions. But there was one thing she couldn't shake: the box, the small black package. The officers were carrying it had been so carefully handled, like it contained something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Was it something explosive? Or perhaps something even worse? And why had they chosen this particular flight to bring it in? Was this all connected to the man from 14B? Or was there something more sinister going on? Jessica's thoughts raced as she watched the passengers, leaving some of them glancing back at her with confused or fearful expressions. They had no idea what had just unfolded in the cabin, but they could feel the tension in the air. It was thick like smoke from a fire, and it made every step toward the exit feel like a journey into unknown danger. She felt her pulse quicken as she moved back to the galley where the other attendants were gathered now, speaking in hushed tones, their faces pale, their bodies tense. No one knew what to say, not a single one of them had any idea what had just happened. But they could all sense that they weren't going to be the same after this. Something was changing, something had already changed. And it was only a matter of time before they would all find out exactly what that something was. The lead flight attendant gave Jessica a quick glance, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held a hint of fear as she spoke. "Jessica, stay here with the other crew members. Just make sure everything's cleared before we leave the plane." But Jessica didn't respond. She couldn't. She was too focused on the detectives in the cabin, now talking to a few remaining passengers. Her mind still racing, she wanted to ask them what was going on, what was in that box. But she knew they wouldn't answer her, not now, not with so many people still present, and so many things still hidden from view. She could feel her anxiety rising again as she tried to focus on the tasks in front of her. But it wasn't working. Her mind kept returning to the man in 14B, to his outbursts, his accusations, the strange connection she felt to him. It was like he had known something she didn't, something that had been gnawing at her for hours now. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her. One of the detectives had come into the galley. His face was grim, and his eyes were scanning the crew quickly before he settled on Jessica with a look of quiet urgency. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," he said, his voice low but firm, his presence immediately commanding all attention. Jessica's stomach tightened, her hands shook slightly as she turned to face him for the first time. The man's voice was steady, but his gaze was intense and piercing. She nodded slowly, afraid to speak, afraid of what he was about to say. He motioned for her to follow him, and she did without question, her feet moving on autopilot through the narrow aisle. As she left the galley behind, the sense of unease was growing more overwhelming with each step she took. She followed the detective down the steps onto the tarmac outside the plane. The cold night air hit her immediately, but it did little to clear her head. The city lights of Salt Lake City shimmered in the distance, but they couldn't mask the feeling that something wasn't right, something dangerous was happening just out of sight. She felt the detective's hand gently on her shoulder as he led her toward a small group of officers standing near a black SUV. It was clear that they had been waiting for her. His grip was firm, but not painful, and the way he looked at her made her feel both reassured and terrified at the same time. Something was unfolding around her, and she had no idea how it would end, or if she would make it out of this unscathed. When they reached the officers, they all turned toward her, their faces grave, their eyes hard with something she couldn't place. But there was no time for questions, not yet. The detective who had led her outside stepped forward. He looked her directly in the eye. "Jessica, we need you to understand something," he said, his voice calm, but his words carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. "You're in the middle of something much bigger than you know, and we need your help now." But before she could respond, he was interrupted by another officer who stepped forward, holding the black box tightly in his gloved hands. He looked down at it as though he were afraid of what it contained, and when he looked up at Jessica, his eyes were wide with something like fear. "There's no time to explain everything," he said, "but whatever you saw back there, whatever happened in the cabin, isn't over. This is just the beginning." The words sent a cold shiver down Jessica's spine, and for the first time since boarding the plane, she realized that this wasn't just a random incident. It wasn't some isolated breakdown. It was something far darker and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. And now she was a part of it, a part of something that was only just beginning. The air around her seemed to grow colder with every passing second. The weight of the officer's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Something was unfolding, something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. Jessica felt her breath catch in her throat. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and the feeling of dread was so overwhelming that it almost choked her. She wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but the officer's expression silenced her. Before she could speak, she stared at the black box in his hands, her eyes wide, her mind racing with possibilities. But none of them felt real, none of them seemed to explain the terror creeping up her spine. The officer holding the box was shaking slightly, his grip tightening, as though the very thought of opening it was too much to bear. Jessica felt herself step back instinctively, as if creating distance would make the situation less dangerous. But she knew that wasn't the case. The danger was all around them now. It was in the air, the ground under her feet, and the uncertainty of what would happen next. The detective, who had been speaking to her, looked at the officer with the box, then back at Jessica. "There's something inside that box," he said, his voice low and serious, "something that could put everyone at risk. And right now we need you to tell us everything you remember from the flight. Every detail matters, even the smallest thing." He paused for a moment, watching her closely, as if weighing her response. Jessica's mind was spinning. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to focus. But all she could think about was the man in seat 14B, his strange behavior, his wild accusations, and the way he had looked at her like she was the key to his madness. She remembered his words clearly. "The whole damn world's in on it." She shuddered involuntarily, the thought of that moment making her skin crawl. But she had no answers, no explanations. She only knew what she had seen, the chaos he had unleashed, and the chilling uncertainty that followed. She took a deep breath and tried to steady her voice as she spoke. "I remember him standing up and shouting at me." She began her words slow and measured. His voice was so loud it almost felt like he was speaking through me. He was accusing everyone of being part of something bigger. I don't know what exactly, but he was convinced that he wasn't the only one involved, that we were all part of some plan. But none of it made sense. It was all just words that didn't connect to anything real. But she knew something was missing, something was wrong about it all. She paused again, her mind flashing back to the moment when the man had been escorted off the plane, the way the other passengers had reacted, the fear in their eyes. But what was most troubling was the way the man had looked at her just before the officers had arrived. His eyes had been full of something dark, something she couldn't place, like a secret. He was carrying something that had made him break and lash out. But what was it? What had caused the sudden shift in his behavior? And why had he picked her to focus on in that moment? The officer holding the box stepped forward, slowly, his expression grim, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to move quickly," he said, looking around as if to make sure no one was listening. "Whatever is inside this box is connected to what happened on your flight, and we have reason to believe that there are others out there just like him. They're watching, they're waiting, and they're preparing." Jessica's heart skipped a beat as the officer's words sank in. "Others out there just like him." She didn't know what to think. The reality of the situation was starting to set in like a cold, suffocating grip on her chest. She looked around the small group of officers, wondering if any of them had the answers to the questions swirling in her mind, but their faces were unreadable. They were professionals. They didn't have time for fear or panic. And yet Jessica could feel it creeping in at the edges of her thoughts, the feeling that no matter what happened next, things would never be the same. She was no longer just a flight attendant caught in an unpredictable situation. She was part of something much bigger now, something much more dangerous. The detective who had first spoken to her took a step forward and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Jessica, we need you to stay with us," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Don't let the fear get to you. Keep your focus on the here and now, and we'll get through this together." But even as he spoke the words, Jessica knew they were all in uncharted territory. They were moving forward blindly into a storm they couldn't control, and no one knew just how dangerous it would be. When the storm finally hit, she looked at the box one more time, her mind racing, the uncertainty of what was to come clinging to her like a second skin. The only thing she knew for sure was that the danger wasn't over, and the worst was yet to come. The cold air outside the plane seemed to press in on her as Jessica stood there, frozen in place, the weight of the officer's words still heavy in her mind, and the box in his hands seemed to grow larger with each passing second. She couldn't help but glance at it again. The fear that had been growing inside her all night now had a shape, a form, a focus, something that was right in front of her, and it terrified her. She thought back to the man in seat 14B, and the way he had ranted and raved, his voice full of wild accusation, and panic, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he had known her, or maybe seen something in her that she couldn't understand. His words echoed in her mind. They were watching, they were waiting, they're all part of it. Just like me, was he talking about the authorities, the detectives? Or was there something more, something darker behind it all? The officer with the black box turned to one of the others and spoke quietly. The other officers moved quickly, and with purpose, their faces grim and determined, like soldiers preparing for an unseen battle. Jessica felt a chill run through her. She had seen them in action before. They were efficient and professional, but the unease in their eyes told her everything she needed to know. They were scared too. The detective who had first spoken to her now stepped closer, his voice barely audible. "We need to get you out of here now," he said, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder, as though offering some comfort. Though she wasn't sure it worked, she nodded silently. But her body felt numb, her mind racing, as she tried to process everything that had happened. How had it escalated so quickly? How had the simple act of serving drinks on a flight turned into this, some kind of conspiracy unfolding before her eyes? She was just a flight attendant, but now she was trapped in a nightmare that had nothing to do with her, nothing to do with any of them. She was caught in the crossfire of something far greater, something that was just beginning to unravel. Jessica couldn't help but wonder if they were all being used, if they were part of a plan that had already been set into motion. And now they were all paying the price for something they didn't even understand. The detective led her away from the plane toward the waiting SUV. But as they walked, Jessica could feel the eyes of the other officers on her, their glances filled with something she couldn't place. It wasn't concern, it wasn't reassurance. It was something colder, something that made her feel like a pawn being moved on a chessboard. They reached the SUV, and the detective opened the door for her. She stepped inside. Without a word, her heart still pounding in her chest. As the door shut behind her, the vehicle started moving, and she looked out the window at the dark roads leading away from the airport, the lights of the city fading into the distance. But her mind wasn't focused on the city, it was focused on the box, the strange black box that had been carried off the plane and now sat somewhere within their reach. What was inside it? What did it have to do with the man in seat 14B? And why was it so important that it couldn't be allowed to leave the airport? What had they been hiding from her all this time? The detective sat across from her, his face hard and unreadable, his eyes scanning the road as if he were on high alert. The other officers in the vehicle were equally quiet, their tense silence only adding to the thick atmosphere that hung in the air. Jessica wanted to speak. She wanted to ask them what was really happening, what had they uncovered, but she knew they wouldn't tell her, not yet, not until they were certain of what they were dealing with. The vehicle turned sharply onto a smaller road and began to pick up speed. The sound of the tires against the asphalt almost drowned out her thoughts, but she could still hear the hum of the air conditioning and feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She felt her chest tighten and her breath shallow. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was sit there, trapped between the growing fear inside her and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The detective finally spoke, his voice steady, but with an edge of something that was hard to ignore. "You're going to be okay," he said. But it wasn't reassuring. It didn't make her feel any safer. In fact, it made her feel more exposed, more vulnerable, like they were trying to convince her of something they weren't sure of themselves. He paused for a moment, as if considering whether to say more, but then he added, "Just stay calm. Whatever happens, don't panic." And Jessica felt a strange sense of dread seep into her bones. Was that supposed to be comforting? Because it didn't feel like it as they drove further into the night toward an unknown destination. Jessica could feel the darkness closing in around her, and despite the detective's words, the truth was clear to her now. She was part of something much bigger than herself, something much darker and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And there was no turning back now. The worst was still ahead, and she was right in the middle of it all.